Thank you, Joe, for doing the work, spending the money just to invite us, get me coming here. Joe and I go way back, like around 1999 and 2000 is when we first started connecting on the internet. There's a friend that sticks closer than a brother, and for me that is Joe Jordan. Actually, no lie. We even said over dinner last night around some mutual friends that are speakers here tonight that Joe said over the years there have been people that unfriended him because he wouldn't unfriend me. And that's a lifelong debt as far as I'm concerned. Been a very faithful friend, Joe. I'll also start by saying I always like to give a shout out to Barbara Beck, who is the owner now and publisher of the Roswell Daily Record, for granting me the permission to use this images. If you see them on the internet, I advise you don't right-click them and put them into anything that you profit from, or you will hear from the Roswell Daily Record, and rightly so. My name's Guy Malone. The CBP there is passed a couple tests, certified Bitcoin professional. And I only kind of bring that up because the talk that I'm about to give you is like, for fun and profit, I can explain Bitcoin to people. Not necessarily quickly, not all at once. And then for not for profit, I sometimes have had the pleasure of explaining even Jesus Christ to people. But that said, this is sort of my favorite talk that I get to give because some of those other things, they just take a while to settle in, you know? You'll get back to it a week or a month or 10 years later and maybe try to wrap your head around it a little more, or your heart. But in this one presentation, I actually get to see the light bulbs go off. I get to see people's, oh. And I'm gonna present to you something that 90% of you here are very not inclined to think that I'm going to successfully argue that the Roswell crash was man-made incident. It was just us. It's not the first time I've done this talk, though, so I'm a little confident that I'll pull it off okay. Joe, he said he's seen it. Thank you for that wonderful thing you said at the end of the last one as a setup. But on the slight chance, rolling into my notes, the slight chance that someone here doesn't know, the Roswell Daily Record is a newspaper, and it is the newspaper that broke the story of the Roswell crash. I was privileged to speak at their event this summer as well, and I got to introduce myself. I'm the op-ed page as far as the Roswell UFO, or the Roswell Incident lecture series. We have our July Roswell UFO Festival in Roswell, New Mexico annually. So to speak to that crowd with what I'm about to tell you, you can realize this guy's either super crazy or he's got an airtight case to walk away without getting beat up or bloodied. When I say I'm the op-ed page, I'll say that's how newspapers are supposed to work, though. You have points of view that oppose the mainstream point of view, but you give them equal time. I'll show you something where I've been in the paper for this talk in a minute. But I first published and I began sharing this in 2002 with the publication of RoswellUFOcrash.com. You can fact check me on that domain. I've held it for well over 20 years now. And that's where you can also go for many of the links and the government documents that I'm going to be presenting and sharing with you today. That other URL, MrRoswell.com, it will take you to much of my other work, especially my more recent stuff. It was just an available domain and very memorable. You might forget my name, but I don't think you'll forget MrRoswell.com. So you'll always be able to access my work if you just remember that. I don't even have it on a card. I think I got a really memorable URL last summer. But I meet a lot of people regularly, so the MrRoswell.com, it's like one of those links directories, and it has an older 90-minute version of this talk that Joe and I did in 2018. And it's got a couple videos and stuff you won't see in this one. I've cut it out for the sake of time, and I only had 1 hour the last time I did this talk, and I had to cut my 90 minutes to an hour, and then I went ahead and added 5 minutes to cover all the current, like David Grush and all the whistleblower headlines that were really hot just a couple months ago in the summertime. So now Joe's giving me all this extra time, and I'm like, no, I only need an hour, and I hate question and answer. I'm not good at that. I got to have my notes. But if we have time at the end of it, I'm going to show you around Roswell via PowerPoint. Invite you to come up and see me up there sometime maybe. But On to this. You may not now have said, this talk argues that the famous flying saucer that was captured by the Roswell Army Airfield in July of 1947 was not the result of an alien craft from outer space crashing in the Roswell region, or Corona, New Mexico, really, is where it happened. Kind of like the first cover-up story, except I'm not arguing for the weather balloon like General Ramey famously claimed in 1947. So starting with a show of hands, this crowd, you're interested in UFOs, you probably have already heard of the, how many know of a formerly top secret program called Operation Paperclip? Wow, good. But Operation Paperclip, it's been covered by many people since 2006. There's even an X-Files episode on it. But back in 2002, it was a long uphill road to talk about Operation Paperclip or to expect that anybody would believe it. I'll go through the basics of it, but a little faster than I've done in the past since you know a lot of it already. I love that show of hands. And I do not believe that the Roswell incident was simply a weather balloon, as the Army Air Force stated and as the Roswell Daily Record supported or reported the next day after General Ramey emptied the famous Roswell saucer. The article reads, General Ramey says disk is a weather balloon. An examination by the Army revealed last night that the mysterious objects found on a lonely New Mexico ranch was a harmless, high-altitude weather balloon. That was the official story reported to the public. It stood for nearly 50 years, and as you probably already know already, people who were even slightly in the know were ordered not to speak of it, including reports of death threats if they did. There was a local radio station that was actually threatened by a phone call from Washington, D.C., that they would lose their FCC license if they aired the interview, which they recorded with Mac Brazel right afterwards. He was the rancher who found the debris, called up the Army, hey, is this one of yours? But he stated in this Roswell Daily Record article the second day that he'd previously found 2 weather observation balloons, called them into the Army, but what he found this time did not in any way resemble them. So nobody really believed the weather balloon story, but they were afraid to question it too much further as well. Just in time for Roswell's very famous 1997 50th anniversary of the incident, the Air Force came out with what is known as the Project Mogul Balloon explanation for their 1997 Case Closed book, that basically they admitted that they were in fact lying in 1947 about a harmless high-altitude weather balloon, but that they were lying then to cover up a very different secret type of balloon. Both the 1947 and the 1997 official explanations offered by our government, they're so full of holes enough to be classified as just ridiculous fabrications. So you've got the alien hypothesis, you've got the original weather balloon story, and then you've got the revised top secret mogul balloon story. So, however, there is now a 4th hypothesis on the table. It has gained a lot of ground in the last couple decades, especially among researchers, anyway, MUFON types, but not so much in Hollywood or the mass media, definitely not the general public, or in Roswell, where the whole alien story, the crash, it makes us lots of money these days. It makes us money, therefore it is good. I don't need to know the truth, and I don't care, is the prevailing attitude in Roswell. It's really hilarious. But normally, when I first presented this same talk publicly in the 2010 Roswell UFO Festival, at the City of Roswell's official conference for that matter, I didn't get lynched or booed off stage. I'm really hoping that pattern does hold out for today as well. There's a front page article in the Daily Record with Nick Redfern and I during the 2017 UFO Festival, and the Daily Record gave our alien skeptic presentation some very nice remarks. And that's the headline that Lisa Dunlap there came up with, separating the extra from the terrestrial, I thought was awesome. But again, just responsible journalism. That's the Roswell Daily Record, putting a very different opposing local view right there on the front page, not just on the op-ed page either. So I presented this also in Nashville, at Philadelphia MUFON, and we know that there's some true believers in those crowds. So just a reminder, I didn't get lynched there either, but the funny thing is their site has like over 100 comments when they put this on YouTube. The most disparaging remarks anybody made out of 100 MUFON people about what you're about to see was they complained about my glasses like a dozen times in the comments, how distracting or weird it was. So hope it doesn't bother you if I do this. I'm reading a little more than winging it this time. So all of the images, quotes, documents, book links, anyway, there they are, again, for you to check out at RoswellUFOcrash.com. Since 2002 is when I first stumbled on this line of research, thanks to Dr. Michael Heiser, a PhD theologian. He's also spoken with us in Roswell many times. He's now deceased recently, I'm sorry to say. Well done, sir. Well done. But today I'm going to mainly share with you a lot of historical, accurate, and now known facts, documents about what our government and our military, in very highly compartmentalized ways, like the Manhattan Project, they were, in fact, already working on in 1947 that most people today have never actually heard about. But the facts that I think most people agree on, in July 47, an unusual craft crashed in the desert of New Mexico. The Roswell Army Air Base was involved in recovering the craft and possibly bodies. You were asking earlier today. We'll cover some of that. On July 8th, the Roswell newspaper published a front-page article, Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region, but following orders, the military recanted the flying disc press release hours later, claiming in the next day's newspaper that it was just the weather balloon. And the undeniable fact still today, number 5, is that the United States government has been lying to us about it ever since. And this is when the Air Force changed their story in 1997's official Roswell Case Closed book. They added this crazy little bit about literal crash test dummies being their explanation for the bodies that people reported. The problem was researchers immediately pointed out, I think Stanton Friedman gets the credit for saying it first, is that these dummies had not even been invented in 1947. Right. They were not used by the Air Force for anything until 1953, and that is so easy a fact to verify that it's led some to conclude, I heard Mike Heiser say it, is that not only was the Air Force lying, again, in 1997's report, but they wanted people to figure out that they were lying. What I'm positing is that they unofficially, even via their very first press release from 1947, want people to think the incident was extraterrestrial. And that is to cover up some very, very ugly truths, starting with Operation Paperclip. I grabbed this in 2002 from NASA.gov. These are the first 104 Nazi German scientists of very many who were moved here to the United States immediately following World War II. It's very well known now. It wasn't known at all in the 40s, though, because it was illegal that they were even here. I'll prove that in just a second. I'll get to that quick, but this is from the current Wikipedia entry. They were originally moved to Fort Bliss, Texas. And then some were taken to White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. And many of them were previously taken, they were working on some very interesting advanced flying craft prototypes for Adolf Hitler in the closing years, months after World War II. Among those pictured right there is Wernher von Braun, who went on to NASA and Disney fame eventually. Historians now tell us that before von Braun and these others came to America, had Hitler gotten his working flying machines that they were all inventing prototypes of, that if they'd gotten all that into mass production before the Allies showed up and invaded Germany, that the Allied forces would have lost World War II. Here's the earliest, maybe the most definitive books on that subject of paperclip. Tom Bower's book published in 1987, and that is long after the most famous books on the Roswell crash that I'll get into in a minute that were ever published, but I'll point out, 1987, this book on paperclip came out. They grabbed weapons, instruments, tools, and above all, scientists from the German Nazis that basically should have gone to Nuremberg and been hung for their war crimes. There's also Linda Hunt's 1991 book, Secret Agenda. The government fought her so hard on the documents that she was digging up through her Freedom of Information Act requests, they eventually presented her with a bill for $239,000 in what they called search fees. And it just sounds like they were trying to scare her off, maybe. But these scientists were secretly brought into the United States under a media blackout program that paper-clipped fake bios on top of their Nazi crime dossier, because President Truman was personally, adamantly against putting certified Nazi criminals on the American payroll. Truman said, this restriction, had they not been able to bring these guys in, would have rendered ineligible most of the scientists, including Wernher von Braun and Arthur Rudolph. They were earlier classified as a menace to the security of the Allied forces. Truman expressly said that no real practicing Nazis could be brought into the U.S. We can only speculate to why, by the way, but von Braun's real dossier is still unavailable to the public, classified. 1 second aside, he also claimed that our government was going to fake an alien invasion one day. I've got a yellow flyer out on the table where I've got the quote for him, and I own the domain now, thefakealieninvasion.com, to let you travel down that rabbit hole at your own leisure. I'm not going to argue it today. And Werner von Braun had said sometime, first it would be the Russian scare, and then the Middle Eastern crazies, and then an asteroid, and then a fake alien invasion would be the last card. And it's all a lie, is what he said. His secretary actually is the one who he was instructed. He told her, say this, give speeches for me. And that was always very consistent, her message, that the alien card would be the last card that our government was going to fake us with, just like the war on drugs and the war on terror. You know, come on, unlimited black ops, no accountability, and more taxes and more restrictions on us. I'm just going to say they're only getting better and better and better at that trick nowadays. But getting back to the relevance of Roswell 1947, and again, Dr. Michael Heiser and his book, The Facade, is what pointed me in this direction of research, and that was published in the year 2000. So, say all that, that's at least how long that I know of that this type of information has already been out there and available for UFO researchers to draw on, prove, or disprove. I have to run through some of these way too quickly. You can go back to that older version of my website, I said, to get more detail. But these two articles, both of which went online in November 2005, one in the US and one in the UK, they both sum all of this up very succinctly. From the BBC, thus began Project Paperclip. Its aim was simple: to exploit German scientists for American research and to deny these intellectual resources to the Soviet Union. All of these men were cleared to work for the United States, their alleged crimes covered up and their backgrounds bleached by a military which saw winning the Cold War and not upholding justice as its first priority. This same BBC article I have, it includes a picture of what we now very nonchalantly know of as the stealth bomber, formerly one of our most highest classified crafts, but this article actually refers readers back to a World War II German craft, the 1944 Horton Ho 229, as being, I have it underlined in red there for you, I know you can't really see it, but underlined in red as the first stealth aircraft. The 1994 Horton Ho 229, Germany, it's referred to in a 1970 book, Warplanes of the Third Reich, now part of the popular Roswell mythology, I will dare say, associated with the Roswell crash, has always been the idea that these stealth aircraft, namely the B-2 bomber, was back-engineered from the Roswell 47 crashed ship. The BBC and all these other places started covering in the 2000s that Operation Paperclip was the origins of this. The BBC actually refers to our B-2 stealth bomber as a modern clone of the Horton, and the caption under the photo reads, "The stealth bomber based on a 1944 German design." The article speculates that the U.S. may have developed even more Nazi technology, including anti-gravity devices, potential sources of vast free energy. Apologies to Stephen Greer if he sees this, if that's anywhere near true. But the article, again, suggests that what our modern UFO advocates refer to as this truth embargo, using Stephen Bassett's term, or even Richard Dolan's national security state, that didn't begin in 1947, as most will say. It's weird, but I'm going to say that the real cover-up of the Roswell crash actually began in 1945. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the front page of the New York Times, November 17, 1945, bore a curiously vague headline: "The 88 German scientists reach here reputedly with top war secrets. The scientists arrived on a converted ocean liner the day before. Unusual precautions were taken to keep the arrival secret," the Times reported. "Reporters were warned away." So in short, the arrival of the Nazi scientists who were here to teach the U.S. how to build advanced aircraft was covered up beginning in 1945. That's when the cover-up of the Roswell incident began in the New York Times, 1945. Skipping some but sharing the darker portions of the article, men who just 7 months earlier had been at war with the United States were being ushered onto our shores by the government. The purpose? to jumpstart American high-tech industry. So the program's architects were sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on human subjects. These men and women were in essence spoils of war, and also Great Britain, France, Argentina, Yugoslavia were taking these scientists in. Rivalries grew fierce in the months as countries hid information from one another and scrambled to snag the best equipment and the best talent for themselves. By early next year, she writes, 150 scientists were working across the country at locations like Wright Field. Wright Field is where the wreckage from the Roswell 1947 was eventually taken. It's a very significant detail because author Christine Gibson here continues to tell us that the slave laborers who were experimented on specifically, I have it underlined in the PowerPoint, to determine what pilots could withstand. Because you see, back in the 1940s, the Nazis were allowed to experiment on humans to determine what pilots could withstand. It wasn't illegal, and it wasn't illegal in the U.S. at the time either. But Paperclip left behind another darker legacy. The program's architects, post-45, were sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. These experiments and Paperclip itself were among the first manifestations of what became a guiding principle of the Cold War, that the ends sometimes justified the means. And Ms. Gibson lays out beautifully here the rationale for Operation Paperclip, and the fact that these two separate articles came out in November 2005 on opposite sides of the ocean. It kind of indicates to me that whoever controlled the press then was just kind of okay with the American people finding out about the Nazis working on U.S. soil finally, but 60 years after the fact, and after two important books were already published, proving it and blowing the lid right off. So you might understand, though, in the 40s, why under no circumstances that information could be let out to reach the American public. What if you had just lost two sons fighting the Nazis? How would you react in 1947 to finding out that they're living here in the United States now and eating very well on our tax dollars? The Paperclip scientists, they were not only brilliant with their technology, but they were very adept and willing to perform experiments on human test subjects, specifically, as we said, to determine what pilots could withstand. So if you're already having some trouble with where you think I'm going with this, I'm going to warn you now that the lecture does take some very darker turns eventually. But back to the Horton vehicle, and this is kind of fun. Here's a few more pictures. I'll skip through the notes on them. These are just what they were developing. The 2009 National Geographic noting, along with many other sources, that the mass production of these craft could have changed the course of the war. Wikipedia state, that's a replica there, that Nat Geo did just for the article. But Wikipedia states that these jets were way faster than anything the U.S. had at the time. One of these says something about Indiana Jones. One of these is like created for the movie Hasbro or something. One of these cites Northrop. My Roswell, I have all the notes where these pictures came from linked to. But we know Germany had these vehicles in prototype prior to the end of World War II, but does that necessarily mean that the American military ever got them? And what's all this got to do with Roswell? So here's some documentation from before those 2005 articles ever came out that I read from. A January 1946 document I pulled back years ago for, again, Dr. Heiser's website with a declassified stamp, originating from, looking at the top right underlining there in red, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. I've added that red text so you can read the small type on the report's title. It is unclassified, but this is the actual cover page of a document that proves that our government, the Air Corps back then, had a working knowledge of the German flying wings designed by the Horton brothers. They were authorized to begin working on them here in the U.S. at Wright Field in 1946. From Wikipedia, here's a picture of one being unloaded from a train in August of 1945. The entry for the Horton in Wikipedia ends by saying, Northrop was chosen partly because Jack Northrop had been building flying wings since 1939. So why is this important today? Two reasons. Number one, if you didn't work for Northrop Corporation or for the United States military compartment that brought this aircraft over here from Germany in August 45, or if you weren't privy to Operation Paperclip in the mid-1940s, that clandestine operation being carried out specifically against the president's orders, so only a very small number of people knew about that. But if you weren't in one of those two categories, odds are you didn't know that a craft like this ever even existed. And it's important, number two, this incredibly important reason here. Who here knows who this is? Shout it out. Kenneth Arnold. The pilot, yes, in June 1947 said that he witnessed some amazingly fast airships over Mount Rainier in Washington State. Very important to note, though, he described their flight characteristics as skipping like a saucer. And as a result, in June 1947, the press coined the phrase flying saucer based upon what this pilot, Kenneth Arnold's testimony, which that's bad journalism. Because he said that it skipped like a saucer in its flight, not that it looked like a saucer. And what he drew is obviously not saucer-shaped. Flying saucer is just the term the press coined. When? In June 1947. The Roswell Daily Record reported that a flying saucer was captured on a ranch in July 1947. So the term flying saucer, it's not based on any physical or eyewitness description of any craft at that time. There's other ones worldwide, definitely. It was just the phrase that had been popularized by the press. Watch the screen here for me. Oh, that's another little Arnold quote. Keep your eye on the screen here because I'm going to move them quickly. We now know that these guys, Operation Paperclip, scientists from Germany, who were working on reproducing these types of craft, that's another Wikipedia image of the old Horton, for American use, and that the Paperclip scientists were spread across Fort Bliss, Texas, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, and of all places, White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. Couple-hour drive from where I live in Roswell, maybe 3. But based on that, would anyone argue now that what Kenneth Arnold described in 1947 was really from outer space? You see, I'm very bound to the PowerPoints for this presentation. I got to get them in the right order. So actually, according to the slide I had up earlier, even Kenneth Arnold didn't think it was from outer space, but you know how people are. So those of you, if you're already really researched on the Roswell incident, there's a bit of a controversy about the shape of the craft, recorded or recovered in 47, not being actually round or saucer-shaped. We have that pictured in our head due to cartoons or Hollywood artwork. But Exhibit A, I'll say the main books on the Roswell incident that first got everybody's attention were Crash at Corona, not Crash at Roswell, by the way. It's a few hours away. Crash at Corona by Don Barliner and Stanton Friedman, and The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt. It's been rewritten a bit since the original version. Updated with startling, shocking new information and revelations, I'm sure, and it's actually retracted a bit of this original story, but what's in front of you is the bestsellers, and there's some parts retracted from this first version that the authors no longer affirm, but the original Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt books shown here are the basis for, I bet everyone here has seen this almost, the 1994 movie, Roswell. The UFO cover-up, these authors are also credited as the writers of the movie on the movie database. So what they said then is the basis for what most of the world believes about the Roswell crash, is really my main point in drilling through all that. But I have in my possession an original drawings by a gentleman named Frank Kaufman, who also served in the Roswell Army Air Base's 509th Bomb Squad in 1947. He claimed to have been involved with the cleanup of the wreckage and the bodies, and the images that he drew are his alleged firsthand eyewitness testimony of what he cleaned up, or at least saw. And you can see that version of the craft that he drew is also not round, but it's more of a manta shape than it was circular. He worked for the 509th Army Air Base, and that's what he drew. I'm going to go back to another very important note that the original book, UFO Crash at Roswell, it depends largely on Frank Kaufman's testimony and a few others. So if you don't believe Kaufman, the authors themselves no longer do believe Kaufman, they said. But what they did state in the book, I have it in white, the craft that crashed at Roswell was long and narrow. It was not a flying saucer. That's the original Roswell books that came out and got this to everybody's attention. You'd have to review their newest materials and their blogs to find out what's been changed or updated, but only the tiniest fraction of people will ever do that. Those who read the original books, or that they saw they were influenced by the very famous movie, if you have any basis for knowing what the authors now feel, from their original, most popular, best-selling editions. If they say it's not valid, it's been updated or whatever. And me living in Roswell, I know this sounds like a bunch of minutia. I got to get this part right, or there's people that can just call me to the carpet really bad if I don't navigate that deal on Frank Kaufman and a couple other things. But back to his drawings of the craft he allegedly saw, published in the book, Roswell 47. I was there. You can't get this book at the UFO Museum in Roswell, New Mexico. They've never carried it. By Robert Shirky. Shirky and Kaufman worked together, by the way, Kaufman being the artist, Shirky being the writer. So there's some inconsistency among how those various witnesses still describe it, or on whether the Corona crash ship was really round or more triangle or mantis-shaped. But we do know for sure that the U.S. had scientists here working from German designs. While we do have pictures of the Horten, there's another German prototype called the Lippisch P-13 that we only have sketches and models of because the war ended before they got it off the ground, supposedly. But here's a model by fantasticplastic.com of what one would have looked like had the Germans gotten one operational. It's rumored that they did, but yada yada. If built, this is what it would have looked like. So the very same German aircraft scientists who were designing, building, and testing both the Horten craft and maybe the Lippisch in late World War II were brought to the U.S. beginning in 1945 to top secretly design advanced aircrafts for us. So what do you think? Just like the Ken Arnold flying saucer, are we looking at an alien craft on the right, or possibly a U.S.-based model based on German designs? Because it's either really amazing just how close those Germans got in World War II to designing ships that look amazingly like extraterrestrial spacecraft that didn't get here until 1947, or maybe there's a more mundane explanation, is what I'm arguing. Maybe those German scientists who designed the Hortens and the Lippisch in 44, they were given a couple years and a blank check from Uncle Sam. By 1947, maybe they'd come up with a little bit of a spiffier model. And obviously, I can't claim I can document exactly 100% what happened, but I can say there was more going on technologically now and then than the American public had any clue of what was going out, or 99% of the military as well. So maybe an alien ship crashed in Roswell and the government covered it up, or maybe a man-made ship designed by Nazis who were here illegally living in secret bases crashed here, and the government covered it up. Those are the choices now, at least, based on what I've presented. And there's a part of me that wishes I could just sit down now that I've presented this to you. It's kind of convincing. Thank you for hearing me out. But I can't let the defense rest, because if I quit now, many of you are going to bounce back to questions about the bodies and the exotic metal found at the crash site. I certainly did. So if you're in this room, I'm pretty sure you know what I've shared so far doesn't solve this mystery completely yet. So honestly, for my own sake, I just had to start asking questions about the metal and the bodies before I could go public with any of this. And just keep in mind, I have introduced the topic of human experimentation by Nazi war criminals into this talk already for a reason. It does get a little worse in a minute. But if you want to argue that the Roswell crash was round, well, there is a whole stream of sources. You can go on by that. Maybe they didn't look like our own UFO stealth fighters, and there are many other alternate craft being developed. There's not time to give you an exhaustive look, but that man-made UFOs and Hitler's flying saucers, that is a photo right there on the cover. And the author of this book appears in a History Channel. I'd like to play here. We didn't set it up in the PowerPoints, but you can go back to my original video and see a History Channel clip. MrRoswell.com, go to 1947, or email me if this talk replaces it, of History Channel doing the whole Nazi UFO thing very convincingly. I think I got copyright struck for posting it, but years back. But the article I quoted you earlier mentions some of these scientists were taken to South America in addition to Russia and the U.S., and there's this guy named Farrell, Project UFO, that's a good one, man-made flying saucers. This is Farrell. He thinks the Roswell crash actually originated from Argentina, but it was the same man-made technology, not a spacecraft. Today I've concentrated mostly on the Horten model and its resemblance to the Ken Arnold sightings that made flying saucers a buzzword in the U.S. just 1 month before July 1947. But much of the furor, much of the hoopla surrounding the immediate responses to the Roswell Daily Record's first article was precisely because everybody had already heard about the term flying saucer, and they knew that advanced airships were being seen all over the U.S. and reported on. So the scoop of the century truly came when the Daily Record headline read, "Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell region. The fact that there was now one on the ground being examined by our own very incredibly heroic and immensely trustworthy government, perhaps Americans now finally find out the truth of what was behind these things. What's in the flying saucers? Well, that idea was just packed with promise and excitement. But we all know that didn't happen. Because they were hiding aliens from us? Well, possible aliens is just not the only thing worth covering up. I've demonstrated our government was already covering up that the scientists were here, and we were trying to beat the Russians to developing this advanced technology. So we had other secrets to keep as well, and I don't think 1940s Americana society really wanted to know that we had over 100 Nazis living here on secret military bases working for us, and that the president and the top military brass sure as heck didn't want to own up to Operation Paperclip, given that the president's explicit orders were disobeyed and circumvented by those that would soon become the CIA. I'm suggesting that the moral outrage of this fact getting out in the 1940s would have been at least as bad and divisive an issue to our country as the Vietnam War was decades later. It's highly debatable whether we should have even brought these guys into the country, but after World War II, we had the Cold War starting up. All the evidence suggests that the Soviets and a half a dozen other countries were recruiting these scientists, so taking them and their technology into their borders, where would we be today if we had not done the same? Would we even be speaking English? Is where that argument has to end. It's a tough call no matter how you look at it. So just closing it out, the true facts, compared to the one I did a little bit earlier, in 1940 to 45, Nazi scientists were aggressively developing amazing flying machines. In 1945, the U.S. moved them to Texas and White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. In 1947, an unidentified flying object crashes in the New Mexico desert, and the military enforces the greatest cover-up of any event ever discovered by the American public. But the obvious question then, switching gears, is going to become, well, what about the bodies? And again, I got to apologize. This will offend some of you. That is not my intent, but getting to the truth always was. And I just let the research take me where it did, even though it turned out to be pretty dark. You know that I moved to Roswell from Nashville. It was missionary work targeting the UFO cults. So I had a bit of a public presence after a couple years. And I'd get, okay, so what really happened here in Roswell crash? I don't think your review covers any of that. And you live there, eventually you start meeting people that, hey, you know, my grandfather was involved in that. And hey, this person was a sterling silver member of the Chamber of Commerce. And everybody loved and trusted him. And he said something huge happened. He said it was covered up. I kind of, even as a missionary, had to face the fact, what if I'm wrong? Do I need to pack up and go home? Because I was presenting it that it wasn't really aliens, even before I had this talk. But the overwhelming evidence of the trustworthiness and the credibility of the people that I would meet, or at least their relatives and descendants, who were talking about how real this was, I just had to keep digging if I was going to continue living in Roswell, because I was having that moment where what I believed and where what I was learning were not jiving up. But I've mentioned so far the fact that human experimentation was part of what the Nazi scientists were guilty of before they came here. This article is linked from my website, George Washington University's National Security Archives. It documents the human experimentation continued after the war on U.S. soil. It's just a plain text document that matter-of-factly discusses the paperclip scientists as well as the radiation experiments they conducted in the United States after they were here at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in the United States after it was here. And it reads in part, the Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base conducted dozens of human radiation experiments during the Cold War. That's after Roswell. Among them, flash-blinded studies in connection with atomic weapons tests, total body irradiation studies conducted in Houston. The experiments for which the Nazi investigators were tried include many related to aviation, mainly high-altitude exposure studies, oxygen deprivation, and cold studies related to air-sea rescue. The information about how air crew hazards was important to both sides. A number of the military research sites included the paperclip scientists with their backgrounds in aeromedicine, radiobiology. The portfolio of experiments at the USA Air Force School of Aviation Medicine included total body irradiation, like I said, space medicine, flash-blindedness, and this is human experimentation on captive subjects. In March of 1951, human experimentation is a matter of routine 4 years after the Roswell incident, written in 1951 to, quote, seek more first-class scientists and highly qualified technologists from Germany. It's sad. In effect, it's kind of damning, but it's a true part of our American history that our government has many times experimented on humans without our knowledge or consent. There are many lists you can find online. This one I pulled up 20 years ago. 1931 exposes American soldiers and civilian hospital patients to radiation. Biological weapons. In 1944, U.S. uses Navy human subjects to test gas masks, intravenous doses of radiation to human subjects. 1947, LSD tested on military and civilians without their knowledge. So you may find this hard to believe. Just only as recently as 1997, Senator and former astronaut John Glenn submitted a bill to Congress to finally protect Americans from being experimented on without our knowledge or consent. Addressing Congress, he literally had to say, when I looked into it, there's no law on the books requiring that informed consent be obtained. I believe there's need for such a law, and we still don't have a law on the books requiring informed consent be obtained prior to conducting research on humans. Well, finally, Mr. President, 1997, John Glenn is recommending legislation that you and I have to be informed anytime the government or even a corporation wants to conduct experiments on us. It's just a cold, hard fact that the government, and frankly anybody, had carte blanche to experiment on humans without their knowledge or consent. And that definitely includes the Cold War. That definitely includes the period between 1945 and July 47. So relating to Roswell, once you're not afraid to go, where I think many Americans living in 1947 wouldn't have dreamed was possible, is that there's a few explanations for the reported bodies that have come up. Many here you might know actually of Nick Redfern in his 2005 book, Body Snatchers in the Desert. Anybody read that or ring a bell? Yeah, we do co-present, we have once. And I hardly knew Nick when I began writing this in 2002. I'd seen him speak at the Aztec UFO conference. Much less, though, that he was following some leads to working on a book about a man-made explanation for himself on this. On my site, I put forth what I'll call a total shot-in-the-dark hypothesis about the bodies, though. And I was aware then that some people, that human experimentation had occurred, that there were institutionalized people who wouldn't be readily missed, that they were sometimes the targets of these experiments. So, inspired or not, I don't know where I got the idea. I simply went to Google, and based on what some prominent Roswell witnesses claimed, I typed in symptoms: large bald head, big eyes. And I learned for the first time about progeria. And as I wrote on the website in 2002, I hope I've never been more wrong in my life. But children with progeria usually have these features: dwarf, bald head, large head with a small face, prominent eyes, rapid aging of children, disproportionately small bodies given the size of their heads. The children are thin with baldness, average lifespan, early teens. Among the symptoms, diminished growth, hair loss. Children turn old within a remarkably short time. The head is disproportionately large and bald. So the math was adding up there. Nazis on U.S. soil, known for human experimentation, and a Cold War to win. Progeria victims was just an original line of thinking I posted in 2002 as a possible terrestrial explanation. Redfern and Heiser have both said that the people in the crashed ship could have been other human unfortunates. POWs were favorites for the radiation testing. Other possible explanations. Now, when I had Nick review my site, my original theory, at my request, I posted this reply he sent me. I was just honored to have a review from someone like him. But he said, I'd agree that the possibility of the Roswell bodies being humans is a very real one. The only problem I have with progeria hypothesis is that it's extremely rare. Would the Nazis or us have been able to acquire 5 people with progeria of similar appearance and similar height, all in 1947? Good rebuttal. But apparently Nick looked into it a bit more than I ever did. It turns out that the last chapter of his now infamous book is actually titled Progeria. So I'm going to skip through Dr. Heiser's summary of Nick's book in a moment, just to get him in here. Back in this picture, Mike is the one that got me started on the paperclip trail. I think I got him started on the progeria. That was cool. But this is from his old website that starts by saying, the view taken in the facade is that the Roswell crash was, in fact, a paperclip accident. This is an actual government archive picture that he posts, but from a later date, not 47. The facade argues that the bodies recovered at the crash were human unfortunates, mongoloids, Asians, progeria victims, etc., deemed worthy of the type of human experimentation required for testing high-altitude craft. This is a long review Mike gave. It's worth freezing PowerPoints if you really want to dig into this. But Mike was my source for the 1946 report cover that I showed on the Horton Brothers crafts being known of the Army Air Corps in 46. This same document is also in the back of Nick Redfern's book, where he goes into more documentation on the connection between radiation experiments done on humans and POWs, and he builds a paper trail that leads to the Roswell incident. A later email to me from Nick Redfern, he said that several people, old-timers, told him part of the secret where the people came from is a place called Fort Stanton. So Nick tells me do a Google on Fort Stanton, New Mexico, and take a good look in its history, which includes keeping both handicapped people there and Japanese people during the war, and it's just down the road in aviation terms from where the debris was found. So let me read you in Nick's words some documentation regarding the types of humans in general, who were, in fact, being experimented on literally in 1947 by the U.S. government. Reading just one paragraph from Nick's Progeria chapter, citing the November 1947 Biology Division Bulletin at the Clinton National Library. One other critical piece of evidence officially links such conditions as progeria and dwarfism with the activities of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and elsewhere around the summer of 1947. More specifically, the report focused on the results of a whole range of radiation-related experiments undertaken in mid-1947 on no fewer than 54 test subjects, of whom 15 were between 1 and 4 years of age. 7 were controls. 2 were classic cretins. 1 showed some features of hypothyroidism, which were not modified by the treatment. 2 were dwarfs. In 1, the diagnosis was gargoylism. 1 was suspected of progeria, and the least exhibited features of moderate sexual precocity. 27 were more than 4 years old, but less than 15 years of age. 27 kids our government was experimenting on in 1947 to see what pilots could withstand. I added that. That's not from Nick's post, referencing earlier. And that Graves' disease, 4 were dwarves, November 1947, Biology Division, Clinton National Library. So I'm not asking if you 100% believe Nick's hypothesis about some of these kids playing into the Roswell incident or my original progeria or whatever Mike said. I'm not asking you to believe any of this because there's no smoking gun, but I am asking, do you now believe that there could be any terrestrial, earthly explanation for the bodies that were reportedly found in 1947? Because, and I'm really about to stir the pot here, I'm going to say that the only images you've ever previously been exposed to of the Roswell bodies, they were based on something drawn third hand in 1991, 44 years after this alleged meeting occurred between Glenn Dennis and a mystery woman. This 1989 drawing accompanies Glenn Dennis. He's one of the founders of the UFO Museum in Roswell, where I live and work and play and have to talk to these people from time to time. In his 1991 affidavit of his participation in the Roswell incident, at the time of writing this above affidavit that he swore when the UFO Museum, artist Walter Henn drew these sketches under the direction of Glenn Dennis. Glenn Dennis didn't even draw them. The sketches are to depict the drawing allegedly made by Dennis for the nurse. But this nurse is part of the reason that the Roswell incident, the mythology, the story went so well, because he's one of the founders of the UFO Museum, but he is the mortician who was called, and I believe this part totally, he was called by the Army base to provide for them, get this, child-sized caskets. Is how that phone call went. It's part of the official Roswell story for decades. He was called by the Army Air Base to provide child-sized caskets after they arrived back in town with the wreckage from the incident in Corona. But as it relates to this drawing from decades later, he later added some details to his legit child-sized coffin story, which many the story I'm about to tell you publicly disputed. He says he later had a meeting with a nurse from the Army Air Base who was very troubled about what she'd seen, and he drew him a picture of the bodies she'd supposedly seen. So, at age 65, Mr. Dennis is remembering what he claims an unidentified nurse at the Army Air Base drew for him, a nurse no researcher since has ever been able to verify existed. Naomi Self is the name he finally gave for her. And frankly, most say he just made that part up. Google that for yourself and just see what the verdict on what the credible Roswell researchers all say these days, but decades after all these books were first released about the Roswell nurse Naomi Self. And an artist, Walter Henn, drew these sketches for him based on what Glenn Dennis said he remembered in 1989 of this unidentified nurse's 1947 sketch, which he says he lost. And Exhibit A, one of the reasons I've never been invited to give this presentation at the UFO Museum in Roswell is because Wikipedia, not Guy Malone, says Dennis's accounts featured prominently in Crash and Corona. For some, like Carl Flock, Kevin Randall, these inconsistencies that were raised about his story were great enough to discount Dennis's credibility entirely. Researchers found a number of inconsistencies. The sketches Dennis supplied to Friedman in 1989 were discovered to have questionable history. Dennis had not drawn them, as he first claimed. He asked another artist, Walter Henn. Henn said he had been approached by Dennis, who needed to supply a UFO researcher some drawings he claimed the nurse had done. Henn claimed Dennis said, "We can make a lot of money out of this." Drawn third hand 42 years later, that single debatable image is the major source of almost all Roswell body stories, movies, drawings that you've ever likely seen. So the question is this testimony credible? Huge question, given some of this. But for your consideration, I will give you the drawings of Frank Kaufman. I said it's a book you've never been able to buy at the Roswell UFO Museum, whom I introduced earlier, part of the 509th Army Air Base that handled and cleaned up the Roswell crash debris and the possible bodies. And although I admit there's no way of telling how much of his story you can totally 100% believe either, unfortunately, but this is what Frank Kaufman drew to describe the bodies he claimed to have personally witnessed. It's not a third-hand drawing, and Kaufman also attended art school before he entered the military, by the way. So I'll say to you, remind you, no drawing of the Roswell bodies and ship you've ever likely been exposed to is based on testimony that the researchers now even back up. America and the whole world, I'm just saying, is under a mistaken notion that I think I can fairly and accurately describe now as a modern mythology, because these images don't look particularly alien, I'll submit to you, and if that's what was cleaned up, all we know, if you go by what the witness's testimony is that they pretty universally said to have large heads, big eyes, and child-sized bodies. Something like this, I'm afraid. The resemblance here is so eerie that you might say there's actually a 1986 movie with a progeria kid cast as the spaceman in the movie. So we have high-altitude radiation tests were among the exact human experimentation tests being run through all the 1940s, and that disfigured and so-called undesirables were among the favorite victims of these experiments. So with what you know today, I'm simply posing the question is, would you put it past our government, then or now, to put someone like this into an experimental craft just to see what the effects on the human body would be of perhaps never achieved altitudes and speeds, or radiation in the upper atmosphere, or if your ship is nuclear powered and you got to worry about radiation? Would you put it past our government to use someone like this to find out how much radiation the human body could safely absorb? You don't always want to risk losing Chuck Yeager on your earliest experimental prototype and test flights. We all know that you start with dogs and chimpanzees, you work your way up. And I've given this talk many times at the Roswell UFO Festival, and I always got to throw in this line. I'm sorry, I know this is supposed to be a festival, and this view isn't very festive, I realize. But is aliens the only possible explanation for any dead or dying bodies that might have been found at the 47 crash site? I'm sick to my stomach to report to you that the answer is actually no. It's not the only explanation. There was a Cold War to win. Both sides were doing stuff like this. So I can't really expect you to buy into any one line of reasoning 100% that I presented. just from this Google research I did, armchair researcher. I'm just asking you to answer for yourself. Now that you know what people in 1947, and even in 1997, after all the main books on this had been published and widely circulated all these years, now that you know what absolutely nobody was allowed to know back then, you now know that the crashed ship itself does not require a leap to alien spacecraft anymore to explain. So do the reports of odd bodies require an alien explanation either is all I'm putting before you. Heck, if you've never heard of progeria, hypothyroidism, and you saw a human body that looked like this in a weird crash ship out in the desert, what are you gonna think? I mean, it's a forgivable mistake if it's a mistake. But I hope I can lighten it up a bit, close it out, because the memory metal that you may have heard by now, the crashed Roswell ship was made of, or at least partly made of, it was described as being extremely tough, but if crumpled or bent, it would go back to its original shape. There is absolutely nothing like that, of course, that was known to exist at the time, right? Right? There's all this talk about the marvels that were allegedly back-engineered from the Roswell crash, like the stealth bomber we covered earlier, but we now know that was not the case. At the Roswell, most of you, I'm sure, will recognize this book then, based on your responses so far. The Day After Roswell, Colonel William Corso. Salute, sir. He claimed that the top secret file of Roswell information came into my possession when I took over the foreign technology desk. Today, he claimed items such as lasers, integrated circuitry, fiber optic networks, Kevlar material, and bulletproofs. The seeds for the development of all these were found at the alien craft at Roswell and turned up in my files, he says, 14 years later. He says it was alien technology we used, lasers and aircraft equipped with stealth features. And I'm definitely not saying that Colonel Corso was lying. I believe that he believed what he was telling in his book is true to the best of his knowledge, but whoever told him that our stealth technology was back engineered from an alien craft, or whoever told the person above him that told Colonel Corso this, was lying. It's a fact that you now know. You know something today that the retired Army colonel who was put in charge of the Roswell wreckage didn't know when he published this book in 1997. The stealth bomber came from the Germans' technology. It makes it really easy to believe that whoever created the famous files for the filing cabinet for Colonel Corso was put in charge of, that he was lying to Colonel Corso about it. But why would you do that? Why would someone in the government do that to their own men or to someone under themselves? You got to ask. Colonel Corso actually answers the question himself in paragraph 3 of the introduction to his book, telling us that even before his involvement with the Roswell files, he knew a terrible secret that some of our government's most revered institutions had been penetrated by the KGB. Colonel Corso himself testified in 1962, and here's how intelligence and counterintelligence can sometimes work when they suspect that they have moles, and the CIA or the top military officials are trying to figure out who to go after. Where's this leak? So you give one person some top secret intelligent data or experimental technology even, and you tell them it's of Russian origin, smuggled out by our own spies. You give someone else the same technology, and you tell them it's created from Tesla technology. You tell someone else it's from an extraterrestrial craft, for instance, and then you tell someone else Westinghouse invented it, and the government seized it under the military application law. None of these 4 stories have to be true, but you create a little documentation, and you give it to 4 different people, and then you sit back and you wait to see which fabrication makes its way to the Soviets. And that's how you know who your mole is. Colonel Corso could have been possibly a mole in someone above him's point of view. He was one of the people that could be our mole. So here's a story for him. I don't believe Colonel Corso was lying in this book, but I think he was repeating a lie he'd been told that he still believed. The true backstory of the B-2 bomber, though, we all know he was wrong about the Roswell wreckage leading to that technology, and I want to insert, just in light of recent headlines, I had to add this to the talk in July that I just gave in Roswell because it comes up, the current situation, the current whistleblower, David Grush, he's been referenced today. When I was first asked about this, like months ago when it was happening, Joe and I did a 4-hour rumble with Ian and, what's the guy's name? Ian and Sorry, don't worry about it. But we were going on together. You mean the current whistleblower du jour? Bob Lazar, Richard Doty, Colonel Corso, the Blink-182 guy. Okay, so now it's cycled back into the news again that we have the latest and greatest until we all forget about him too. Yeah, I think it's the exact same thing as I just described. If he's not lying, he's being lied to and he's just repeating a lie. We did this 2 hours already, but here's a tweet that I did right then when that came out. Why are the UFO leakers getting slots on TV talk shows, but Edward Snowden is hiding for his life? And then I added, real whistleblowers, journalists are exiled. They're not celebrated. These UFO guys are reading a government script, otherwise they'd be dead or on the run, was my opinion. And then one response I got, I'm just over here waiting on the government to hurry up and fake that alien invasion. And one of the good responses I got to that tweet was, hi, I'm the CIA. You may remember me from such psyops as buy these $3,500 surveillance glasses, Putin man bad. Hey, look, it's aliens, and we don't know where this inflation is coming from. Thanks. I hope I lightened up. There's nothing new under the sun. We just forget about it. We fall for the same government lies 2, 3, 4 decades later. A newer site that I've mentioned I'm working on, get that yellow flyer from the front. If you're still speaking to me after this talk, you can just pick it up and look into the Werner von Braun quotes on the fake alien invasion. And after the Russians, and after the Middle Eastern crazies, and after the asteroid, that the alien card will be the final card. And I'm telling you, Carol, all of it is a lie. Werner von Braun said that in the 70s, if you believe his secretary. Well, finally, there's also the memory metal out there today. It's called nitinol or nitinol, depending on your pronunciation. It's argued by some to be developed in the immediate aftermath of the Roswell incident, as this website and many other ones argument. One of the best videos I have is a guy dropping a thing of nitinol. It's all tied up in a knot. It looks like a paper clip, but it's all wound up. He drops it in warm water, and then it just springs right out and spells the word nitinol. It's really cool. Mr. Roswell, look at the old version of this talk for the video. You'll see what it does when it's bent out of shape. But you're missing out on that. But when he bends the metal, and you can watch the video there, but nitinol is in many of our glasses, not my cheap ones, but if you've got good reading glasses on, prescription, insurance, there's nitinol bending it back into their original shape for you. But that's not what the Roswell witnesses described happening. There was not warm water poured on the Roswell wreckage, so that can't be it, but starting with good old Wikipedia. Nitinol alloys exhibit shape memory and superelasticity. Shape memory refers to recovering the metal's original undeformed shape upon heating. Superelasticity, however, occurs at a narrow temperature range, and no heating is necessary to cause the undeformed shape to recover. Wow, that does describe exactly what Jesse Marcel says he's found. So we ask, how long has this stuff been around? Well, nitinol by that name was more or less discovered during research in 1962 and not developed that we know of until a decade later. But the history of memory metals in general dates back, calling your attention to this red highlighted text, to 1932, according to the same Wikipedia page on nitinol. I first presented this in 2002, 2010 in Roswell as well. I checked Wikipedia this summer. It still supports the 1932 date on the invention of memory metal in Wikipedia. But this source also says these properties were first discovered in 1938, but also says no serious research advances were made until the 60s. And again, I'll just suggest no serious research advances that we know of. How much of this is a stretch, though? If memory metals were first discovered in the 1930s, and you can go find out on Wikipedia yourself, how much of it might have been making its way into experimental crafts from the late 1940s? Breaking news, only in May 2009. Yeah, well-known, I've name-dropped you many times, well-known UFO reporter Billy Cox published an article revealing that the files relating to the history of memory metals development in the 1940s are now missing. Surprise! The files on memory metals' origin and the history of the development are missing from both the U.S. Air Force and the Battelle Institute, both of which Billy Cox noted in 2009 should have them. Add to that, General Craigie If you know his name, he had an office at the Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio in 1947, where the Roswell debris finally wound up, made a hurried flight to Roswell during the UFO controversy. So I forward Billy's article to Mike Heiser, who does some research himself and then blogs. Mike notes, get this, Billy Cox said that nitinol can also be linked to the Oak Ridge Laboratory, a place that plays a key role in Nick Redfern's book, that part about radiation experiments and humans exposed to nuclear-powered aircrafts. Mike adds that perhaps General Craigie went to Roswell because he knew of a highly classified project involving a craft that employed the use of nitinol, a metal that had the properties described by Colonel Marcel. When Craigie heard the reports, did the math, he knew that the project had to be kept under wraps and attention diverted. So keeping in mind the 1946 document, which originated in Wrightfield, Ohio, detailing Horton technology, the obvious question you have to pose is the reason that this Roswell crash was taken to Wrightfield, Ohio, in the first place was simply because that's where the top Army brass, who knew the whole picture, not compartmentalized, but because they worked out of Wrightfield, Ohio. And I'll add to what these guys have written. Is it possible that General Craigie just wanted his nitinol back? Stuff's rare. It was expensive back then to develop. Or was the 47 debris taken to Wrightfield, Ohio, because that's where some of the Nazi scientists were? As Christina Gibson argued for us earlier, it's actually, to me, starting to sound like all of the above. Because the metal from the 1947 incident that was reported by Jesse Marcel, unlike anything known at the time, which usually just leads to the explanation, well, then it just must be from outer space. But perhaps that's a larger or a further leap in logic than is actually necessary. Knowing now that memory metals were also first discovered in the 30s. So kind of closing this out is that in 1947, of course, the general public and 99% of the military knew absolutely nothing about the exotic flying craft the Germans invented or that the American government had in our possession and was working to replicate and to improve upon them before the Russians could do it and come wipe us off the map. And especially in 1947, American citizens would not have believed or even wanted to know that our own government was even remotely capable of fatally experimenting on its own citizens for any reason. But that possibility is so well documented now. But the atrocities that we're talking about would not have even entered their minds. Of course it wouldn't. This was post-World War II. We were the good guys, remember? We're the good guys. But if you did find out about this on accident, like you weren't supposed to know, you weren't in the loop, might you be threatened with death if you spoke of it? You bet you would. The people I've met in Roswell are telling the truth. These were our top secrets at the time, and some of it was being done illegally behind the back of the president and without the consent or knowledge of Congress. So when the 1947 incident occurred, what I've shared with you today, none of this was even remotely within the realm of possibility for people to consider when faced with what the witnesses were telling, what they had at hand and what they came out to tell later over the years. All people knew for 50 years was that an exotic ship made of an unheard of type of metal with strange bodies crashed in the desert, and that the government enforced a cover-up of never before heard of proportions. So, to be fair in this talk as well, it took some really courageous people thinking outside the box, risking their lives and their reputations, at minimum their reputations, to even go on record as considering that the Roswell wreckage might be from another world. They had to think really outside of the box. I have a PowerPoint for that. For even the first 50 years of the cover-up, anyone that's talked about this has done so at the risk of extensive ridicule, especially from your peers and your family. So the witnesses who have come forward over the decades and the researchers who have who put their good names with these stories, they're commended. I think they're to be commended for their courage in many cases, I'd say. And I mean the very legitimate, even the pro-alien researchers that work with in Roswell who believe the alien view of this. Even if I disagree with their conclusions based on the information that I've uncovered, it doesn't mean that I think they're evil or that they're purposely scamming people for the most part. All it means is that their view or mine or both are wrong. But I am suggesting that the proverbial box that people have been thinking outside of to get us where we are today is actually much larger than we ever previously thought. So do we have to go outside of the box today to account for the reported details of the Roswell incident anymore? If everything we've discovered today was public knowledge in 1947, and the news got out that our government recovered a crashed flying saucer in the New Mexico desert and covered it up for some reason, I think what most people would have thought then, if all this, what we've talked about today, was general knowledge, you'd have heard country folk, oh, it's probably another one of those stealthy Horton Lippish spinoff thingies they're working over on White Sands to fight the commies. Hope no one got hurt. What kind of legs do you think the alien theory of the Roswell crash would have ever gotten over the last almost 80 years now if the average American knew about Operation Paperclip or the fantastic flying Nazi machines in 47? Because the main strength behind the extraterrestrial hypothesis relating to the 1947 incident, and quite frankly, has quite frankly nothing resembling any proof of extraterrestrial activity, and it never has been an argument for extraterrestrial activity or proof. The strongest and the only argument for the alien view related to Roswell has just always been simply, well, I've never seen anything like that before, so there's just no other explanation for the reported facts. Other explanations. You really can believe most of the witnesses to the 47 incident, those that have stood the test of time and the scrutiny of researchers. You don't have to think they're crazy. You don't have to think they're lying. You don't have to think they're scamming. But you can also believe that without believing aliens crashed here in 1947. But without some actual evidence, or at least a much stronger case for an alien explanation of 1947, I'm going to have to say that the people who do believe in the alien hypothesis on 47 have actually fallen for a government con. It's a psyop that UFOs and aliens are not being covered up. UFOs and aliens are the cover-up. There's usually two sides to every story. If you've only ever considered an issue side from one side without knowing more about the other evidence, you might never end at truth. This is a really powerful PowerPoint to end on, I've always said, but you're not that lucky today, because I've added to it for us. We just don't always have the right perspective to assess all actual truth from what's true. The last point that I make related to this talk, especially when I'm doing it in Roswell during the UFO festival, is, well, wait a minute, what about all the other Roswell authors who are here with their stories? And the UFO Museum, I emailed the UFO Museum this webpage in 2000, and I still haven't heard back from them. I literally had a shop across the street. We stared each other down in our windows occasionally for fun. But what do all the other published Roswell authors and what does the UFO Museum think about my point of view? It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Thanks, y'all.